within the long list of pontiffs and highest hierarchs of the most enduring institution of the last millennia, that is, the Catholic Church. There was one who, long before being ordained as a simple priest in 1951, used to go by the secular name of Joseph Ratzinger. He was a young German man with a deep religious spirit and a love for study. He would rise through the ranks of the Church and follow his own path of faith until he became the 265th Pope, taking the name Benedict XVI. Considered one of the last great theologians of the 20th century, his short pontificate was not without controversies and criticisms, both from within and outside the Church. His pontificate was one of great intellectual and doctrinal vigor in turbulent contemporary times, marked by internal reforms within the Church and intense academic work. Join us to learn about the story of Benedict XVI, his life, his works, his journey in the Church, and his papacy. Reinaldo José Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the new encyclopedia, and for those who don't know, let me remind you that we now have the new encyclopedia in English and the new encyclopedia in Portuguese. You can give us great support by joining both platforms, which you can find below, and subscribing to both channels. By liking, commenting, and watching the videos, which have great potential. Without further ado, let's start with today's video. Joseph Aloysius Ratzinger came into this world on April 16, 1927, in the German town of Marquette, located in the region of Bavaria in southern Germany. The day of his birth was Holy Saturday of that year's Holy Week, which is why he was baptized on the same day he was born. His father, also named Joseph, was a gendarmerie commissioner, and his mother, named Maria, occasionally worked as a cook, but mostly as a housewife. Little Joseph had two siblings named George and Maria. Years later, both of them would also follow a religious life, with the first becoming a priest and the second a Franciscan nun. Unlike many priests who have felt the call to vocation through a special experience or event, little Joseph has felt a special attention to the divine, the idea of God and spirituality since his childhood years. His parents, curiously named like the Holy Family, Joseph and Mary, instilled traditional Catholic values in Joseph: prayer, love for others, charity, penance, keeping the commandments, and the celebration of Mass and all Catholic liturgies. In this sense, as Joseph grew up, he was forging his own path of faith, which encountered some ups and downs and obstacles along the way. Joseph, although still a child, was living through the instability of the last years of the so-called Weimar Republic, a parliamentary democratic republic imposed on Germany after the consequences of defeat in the First World War. It was a time of severe political instability and economic crisis, during which the National Socialist movement emerged and eventually took power. For now, little Joseph, unaware of this turbulent world, spends his days standing out at school because of his intelligence and his slow but pleasant immersion in the Catholic faith. He receives his first communion at the age of 9 in April 1936 and begins to help as an altar boy in his town. The following year, in 1937, they moved to a small country house in the town of Hufslag. This would be what Joseph would describe as his true home. Silent and enveloping, the rural landscape allows Joseph to meditate, pray, and reflect with much more ease and concentration. In this same year, he receives the sacrament of confirmation. 2 years later, on his 12th birthday, that is, on April 16, 1939. Entering the minor seminary of San Miguel in the neighboring town of Traunstein, could he feel more at home in that seminary? However, this joy would often be cut short by the situation the nation and all of Europe were experiencing in those years. The clash between the European powers amid the rapid changes the world was experiencing would trigger the Second World War. This disastrous war throughout Europe reached Joseph directly in the year 1943. The National Socialist regime issued a decree that forced all high school students, including seminarians, to mobilize for the war. Joseph, at 16 years old and against his will, was forced to swear loyalty to Hitler's regime, and he was assigned to the defense of the BMW factories, where anti-aircraft batteries and important weaponry were produced. Later, in 1944, he was discharged as an anti-aircraft battery assistant and transferred to the Reich Labor Service in Austria. Between April and May of 1945, Joseph Ratzinger decided to desert from the army, even though this action was punishable by death by the SS. That is, the infamous assault squads of the National Socialist regime. But Germany's defeat was near, and after the final fall of Berlin during the American occupation, Joseph is imprisoned for less than a month, until he is released and finally returns home in June 1945. About his time in the war, Joseph would state that God would be absolutely. He was not involved with the National Socialist regime and later avoided discussing his wartime experiences. On one occasion, he stated that, in the face of the empire of atheism and lies represented by National Socialism, Cierro Comillas reaffirmed that the Catholic faith was a bastion of truth and justice. After the war, Joseph continued his priestly career at San Miguel Seminary in Traunstein. He simultaneously studied Catholic theology and philosophy at the Higher School of Philosophy and Theology of Friesinga and the University of Munich. During his studies, Joseph delved into the study of the Bible, especially using the historical critical method, which allowed him to develop a broader and deeper understanding of the Holy Scriptures. In addition, he was influenced by both contemporary philosophers and theologians such as Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers, as well as other classical thinkers, like the Church Fathers, very much in the style of St. Augustine. Most of the doctors of the Church, the great scholastic philosophers, and saints like St. Bonaventure. Joseph's time at the seminary was pleasant in every way, with a comprehensive formation that included prayers early in the morning, the mandatory classes, and the complementary ones in the afternoons. What helped deepen his theological thinking? Joseph Ratzinger is going to study with special attention the liturgy, that is, the Catholic rite, all those forms and methods by which Christian ceremonies and sacraments are carried out. Even though there were no subjects studying the liturgy at that time, Joseph, framed within the so-called German liturgical movement, which sought to revitalize the liturgy and make it more accessible to the faithful, would make the liturgy one of his main spiritual focal points. At the same time, Joseph would declare years later, based on his experience, that the seminary should be, as it was in his case, a period of maturation in which seminarians should balance heart and mind, faith and reason, and assimilate the life of Christ as the model to follow. Finally, after 12 years of formation, although slightly interrupted, the first ones, Joseph Ratzinger is ordained as a priest along with his brother George. On June 29, 1951, at the age of 24, the priestly ordination takes place in the Cathedral of Freising, and Joseph receives the holy oils and the laying on of hands from the then Archbishop Michael von Faulhaber. The following month, he celebrates his first Mass at the parish of St. Oswald in Traunstein, that place which evoked so many memories for him. Shortly afterward, he moves to the parish of Precious Blood in Munich, where he serves as a priest and teaches religion in the town. However, Joseph, who always had a strong relationship with religion and study, soon begins a fruitful academic life. In 1952, he begins his teaching activity as a professor at the Seminary of Freising, where colleagues and students attest to his excellent work. Father Ratzinger, as he was called, had an inclusive approach with his students in which he allowed them to speak freely and to engage in a healthy dialogue for the exchange of ideas and the enrichment of their education. He was also known for having accessible language and an incredible ability to explain deep topics of Catholic theology to the seminarians. The following year, in 1953, he obtained a doctorate in theology with his thesis called People and House of God in Ecclesiastical Doctrine, according to St. Augustine, in which he focused on the concept that the saint had of the people of God. And he addresses major topics such as the Old Testament, law and the sacraments, and paganism, to answer the big question of who or what the church is for St. Augustine, and to set an important precedent in the Augustinian understanding of the church, in light of the major changes in the contemporary world. This doctoral thesis is highly acclaimed and gives Joseph major recognition in academia, both within and outside the church. Without stopping for even a year, in 1954 he presents a dissertation titled Historical Theology, according to Saint Bonaventure. Saint Bonaventure, an Italian saint from the 13th century, was one of Ratzinger's favorite saints, whom he admired, because of his eschatological approach, where history was seen as a succession of meaningful events, oriented toward Christ as the center of all truth and wisdom. Eschatology, very briefly, is the study of ultimate realities, that is, the study of the end of history and the final destiny of humanity, both individuals and groups. In that lecture, Joseph not only addresses St. Bonaventure's eschatological approach, but also talks about two important topics: the relationship between faith and reason, and the so-called natural illumination. According to Ratzinger, Bonaventure's rejection of philosophical science was not for him a rejection that implied a total denial of reason, but rather a search for an appropriate integration between faith and reason. What about natural illumination? Ratzinger discussed the concept of intellectus in Bonaventure, suggesting that there is a form of natural knowledge that can exist independently of faith. This sparked great debates among the theologians of that time regarding theology and Augustinian thought. This dissertation, which we pause to highlight because it was extremely important in the life of Joseph Ratzinger, was initially rejected and his university accreditation was briefly interrupted. The academic theologians who evaluated him considered that Ratzinger strayed too far from the traditional approach by introducing concepts that could seem to conflict with the prevailing scholastic teachings at that time. Ratzinger would carry this disappointment for a long time, until in 1957 he finally received the habilitation to continue his teaching career at renowned universities in Germany. At the same time, while continuing his regular duties as a priest, Joseph began to stand out more and more in the academic world. From 1959 to 1963, he worked as a professor at the University of Bonn. His inaugural lecture was titled The God of Faith and the God of Wisdom. This already reflected his proven interest in studying the relationship between faith and reason, religion and knowledge. By then, Joseph was already a renowned theologian, widely known both in the academic world and in the ecclesiastical world. His intelligence and notoriety did not go unnoticed by the church authorities, who called him to participate in one of the most important events of the 20th century for the Catholic Church, the Second Vatican Council. What in general was the famous and sometimes renowned Second Vatican Council? Well, by appealing to the prerogative of convening a synod or council to gather all the bishops of the church to discuss major questions of faith and of the church itself. Then, Pope John XXIII convened on January 25, 1959, what was known at that time as the 21st Ecumenical Council. The Second Vatican Council marks a historic transition in the long journey of the Catholic Church. Wasn't the world and the Church already, in those days of the Middle Ages, when the Church was the institution that governed social life, and from which knowledge, humanism, morality, and the necessary doctrine that guided human development emanated? With the arrival of the Renaissance from the 16th century and modernity, where God is no longer the center of the world, but man is, and where morality and faith are gradually being replaced by rationalism and technique, a profound dialogue and confrontation between the Catholic faith and new currents of thought begins to emerge. Liberalism and democratic thought, Enlightenment ideas, secret societies like Freemasonry, experimental sciences, large industrial capital, workers and socialist movements, and most of the movements of the 19th and 20th centuries come to challenge the Church's authority over human life. As a result, in the face of all these changes, a generation of men emerged who did not seek to reform the Church as Martin Luther did in the 16th century. Instead, they should focus on calmly and patiently studying the Holy Scriptures, Christ's life, patristics, doctrine, and church history. In order to use all this knowledge to place the Church in that 20th century full of changes, contrasts, and turbulence, members of this generation were outstanding priests and theologians, among whom was Joseph Ratzinger himself, who, as we saw, was criticized in his dissertation on St. Bonaventure, which in some way addressed this conflict between the Church and the Catholic faith and the new modern currents. Therefore, with the main public goal of reforming and not deforming the Church, based as stated on its own history and doctrine. The Second Vatican Council was inaugurated with its first session on October 11, 1962. As an advisor, Joseph provides important theological guidance to cardinal friends and helps shape the discussions and documents of the Council. Soon after, thanks to his outstanding role, he is appointed to the exclusive group of conciliar experts, a panel advising the Council Fathers. He played a major role in the Council. From there, Joseph collaborates in drafting major Council documents, which are still studied today, such as Lumen Gentium, Ad Gentes, and De Verbum. He also helps cardinal friends in drafting 11 speech drafts, where he addresses topics such as revelation, the mission of the Church, and ecumenism, written in the clear, engaging style that marked his speech. He also actively joins debates about the Church, emphasizing the importance of the episcopate and the participation of the faithful, whom he called the people of God, in the life of the Church. During the Council, Joseph split his time between working as a conciliar expert and teaching at the University of Münster, which he joined in 1963, and where he took part in the vibrant religious debate at that university, continuing his educational and theological work until he was transferred to the University of Tübingen, where he arrived in 1966, the first year after the Second Vatican Council had ended. The truth is that the Second Vatican Council introduced major reforms that have played an important role in the post-conciliar history of the Church up to the present day. Some of these included abandoning Latin and using vernacular languages for the liturgy, the active participation of the laity in the liturgy, and the revision of various rites, such as the sign of peace and the prayer of the faithful, to give it a more communal and accessible meaning according to the vision of this council. Regarding what is called ecclesiology, that is, the study of the Church, it emphasizes the role of the Church as a communal and collegial body, leaving aside the purely hierarchical view. Doctrinally, it highlights the central role of the Scriptures and sacred tradition to promote a comprehensive approach to revelation. At the same time, the Church raises its voice with its social doctrine, which sought a new path different from capitalism and communism, thus playing a larger part in global social and political debates. Joseph believed that the council should not be seen as a break with everything the Church had been up to that point, but rather should be seen within, I quote, a hermeneutic of continuity with the previous ecclesial tradition. In any case, after the council, Joseph took a series of steps that would lead him to continue rising within the hierarchy of the Church. After the council, Joseph resumed his demanding academic life. He continued at the University of Tübingen during this time, but distanced himself from it due to the Marxist orientation that the student movement of the 1960s was taking on, which in Germany would soon become radicalized between 67 and 68, causing a long series of disturbances throughout that year. After this, in 1969, Joseph was appointed vice president and professor of dogmatic theology and history of dogma at the Catholic Technical University of Regensburg in Germany. In 1972, he took a big step in his desire to spread ideas and knowledge about the faith by founding the magazine called Communio with other priests and university students, which will quickly become a platform for Ratzinger and other scholars of the faith to assert its meaning and show the world their research. It should be noted that throughout his life, Joseph will publish around 600 written works, some shorter, others much longer. Some of his most important works, published precisely during this period, were Introduction to Christianity from 1968, where he compiles several of his most important university lectures to talk about the foundations of Christianity. In turn, Dogma and Revelation, published in 1973, where he developed how faith is expressed through dogmas and how these can be related to religious experience. In 1977, he published Eschatology, which is a complex theological treatise that reviews the Christian view of life, death, the final judgment, heaven, and hell. However, his formal academic life, though not his intellectual one, would end on March 24, 1977, when at the age of 50 he was consecrated Archbishop of Munich and Freising. This would be a defining moment for both him and the Church's future. Later that same year, on June 27, then Pope Paul V appointed him Cardinal of the Catholic Church. From then on, he held both the position of Archbishop and that of Cardinal. In that same year, during the Synod of Bishops on Catechesis held in Rome, Joseph meets the then Polish cardinal named Karol Wojtyla, with whom he has had an epistolary and intellectual relationship for several years, but he finally meets him in person. The then Pope Paul VI appoints him Cardinal of the Catholic Church. In August 1978, Pope Paul VI dies, and the then Cardinal Albino Luciani is elected as the new pope, taking the name John Paul I. However, this pope dies 33 days after taking office, and the conclave chooses the then Cardinal Karol, a friend of Joseph Ratzinger, as the new pope, who takes the name John Paul II in honor of the previous pope. With the shortest pontificate in history, John Paul II is remembered for his extraordinary religious virtues, his charisma, and his important pontificate on a global level. As noted, he was very close to Ratzinger, and, knowing his great intellect and vast knowledge of the Catholic religion, he appointed him Prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith on November 25, 1981. This was a core position in the papacy and the Church whose purpose was, I quote, to promote and safeguard the doctrine on faith and morals throughout the Catholic world, and to encourage studies aimed at increasing the understanding of the faith, end quote. As established by John Paul II, Ratzinger will thus find a place very much in line with his ever-present intellectual preferences. During this prefecture, Ratzinger stands out for his contribution to the drafting of the very important document called the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a mandatory starting point for Christian faith in the 20th century. The Catechism was published in 1992 after 6 years of preparation together with the Apostolic Constitution, seeking to provide a clear and unified guide for Catholic teaching throughout the world. In addition to his work on the Catechism, Ratzinger oversaw the issuance of several important doctrinal documents that addressed contemporary issues. For example, in '86, a document was published on pastoral care for people with same-sex attraction. And in 1992, a letter was issued to the bishops on this topic. Ratzinger was also very critical and a staunch opponent of certain positions, like the so-called liberation theology, which incorporated Marxist elements into the Christian faith, but which Ratzinger considered incompatible. Catholic faith? In all his actions, Ratzinger sought to preserve the doctrinal integrity of the Christian Church. At the same time, Ratzinger works tirelessly to defend and promote Catholic doctrine in the world, ensuring that the teachings of the Church remain consistent with its tradition. This included addressing controversial issues and issuing statements that reaffirmed the traditional positions of the Church. At the same time, Ratzinger has to face growing trends. They believed that the Second Vatican Council had betrayed the true tradition of the Church, and even raised the possibility of a schism or a division within it, like the case of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who ended up excommunicated for this in 1988. Ratzinger also forbids so-called dissident theologians like Hans Kung and Leonardo Boff from teaching theology, or the Catholic faith for holding views contrary to the dogmas of the Church. For Joseph Ratzinger, faith was not a matter of personal interpretations, but a personal encounter with Jesus Christ, framed within a hermeneutic of faith that integrates Scripture and ecclesiastical tradition to understand the Word of God. Due to his work throughout his 58 years of ecclesiastical life, Ratzinger was elected Vice Dean of the College of Cardinals in 1998 and again in 2002. Due to his 58 years of ecclesiastical service, Ratzinger was elected Vice Dean of the College of Cardinals in 1998. He was elected Dean of the same in 2002, which required him to act upon the Pope's death. Since he was still his close friend, John Paul II, it was Ratzinger who had to organize the conclave for the election of the new pontiff. After John Paul II died on April 2nd, 2005, Ratzinger organized that year's conclave. As many sources from that time confirmed months earlier, Ratzinger was the favorite and was elected Pope on April 19, 2005. Ratzinger had reached the pinnacle of his great career within the Church and had attained its highest rank. The now Vicar of Christ on earth chooses the name Benedict, which means the Blessed One, on one hand to honor Pope Benedict XV, who led the Church during the First World War, and on the other hand, in memory of Saint Benedict of Nursia, founder of the Benedictine order and an important European saint. Even though at first, according to his own words, he did not feel capable or even worthy of taking on the role of Pope Ratzinger, now Benedict XVI accepts the new challenge that God has presented to him. Many believed it regardless of their stance, that Ratzinger was going to return the Church to its state before the Second Vatican Council. He said he would take a tougher stance on the controversial issues of the time. However, none of this happens. Ratzinger is an enthusiastic supporter of the reforms of the Council and favored many aspects such as ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. During his pontificate, Benedict XVI introduced important changes within the Church, although he was not free from controversies and disputes. In the midst of various scandals, he toughened the church laws against abuses committed by some priests. He promoted financial transparency in the Vatican with the December 2010 Motu Proprio, which aimed to prevent illegal activities. And, on the other hand, he strengthened the Church's relationship with art, promoting the proper and respectful use of artistic and musical elements in the liturgy. On the 2007 liturgy, it allows for a broader use of the Tridentine Mass, that is, the traditional and historical form in which the Catholic liturgy was celebrated before the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, allowing the Mass to be celebrated in both ways. The ordinary form uses vernacular languages, while the extraordinary form uses Latin and is based on the 1962 Roman Missal. At the same time, It recommends the use of visible crosses on the altars and refocusing the Mass on the sacredness of communion with Christ. At the same time, it also forbids ritualism and subjectivism, always relying on sacred tradition for the celebration of the liturgy. Benedict XVI would also have a wide doctrinal activity, which begins with the encyclical Deus Caritas Est from 2005, which deals with Christian love and its nature. Then in 2007, he publishes Spe Salvi, focused on Christian hope as salvation, and his third encyclical, Caritas in Veritate. Signed in June 2009, it addresses integral human development rooted in charity and truth. In addition, he promotes the compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church and writes a trilogy about the life of Jesus, which is widely acclaimed. In addition, Benedict XVI created a total of 90 cardinals in 5 consistories, with the purpose of geographically diversifying the College of Cardinals, integrating priests from various parts of the world. However, suddenly during a consistory held on February 11, 2013, Benedict officially announces his intention to resign from the position of Pope. The decision causes a lot of commotion and is the subject of much speculation. The official version is that this was mainly due to the advanced age of the pontiff. He claims that he suffered from chronic insomnia, which was getting worse and did not allow him to continue with his duties. This will continue to be a subject of mysteries and discussions. The resignation became official on February 28, 2013, and Benedict XVI, now the 86-year-old Pope Emeritus, would be the first to resign in 600 years, since Gregory XII in 1415. On the same day, the 2013 conclave began and elected Argentine Cardinal Jorge Maria Bergoglio as the new pope. He would take the name Francis to honor Saint Francis of Assisi, known for his dedication to poverty and humility. What happened to Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI is life after his resignation. In May 2013, he moved to the Mater Ecclesiae Monastery, within the same city, the Vatican, where he would live, dedicated to prayer and to his lifelong intellectual interests. The Church, the mysteries of faith, the great fathers of the Church, the saints, doctors, scholars, monks of all eras. He continued to be addressed as His Holiness and made few public appearances, which, as time went on and his health deteriorated, became increasingly rare. Sometimes he would talk with Pope Francis, who always publicly showed affection for the Pope Emeritus. Between June 18 and 22, 2020, the Pope Emeritus visited Italy to see his seriously ill brother George. However, it would be his last meeting with him because George would pass away on July 1 of that year. Later, already at an advanced age and in a physical condition that reflected his 95 years finally, on December 31, 2022, Benedict XVI, the Pope Emeritus, passed away. Pope Francisco held his emotional funeral on January 5, 2023, and his remains will be laid to rest in the Vatican grottos, where they remain today. Thus ended a long, academically and theologically fruitful life that would mark the history of the Church in contemporary times. Above the complex debates and controversies stirred by the oldest institution of the last millennia, he who was born as Joseph Ratzinger in the turbulent Weimar Republic died as Benedict XVI, the Pope Emeritus, leaving among both devotees and critics a great legacy that undeniably was an example of a devout life and an intellectual drive to unravel the mystery of the Catholic faith, becoming a key figure in this long tradition in recent history. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And I remind you that below you can find the new encyclopedia in English and the new encyclopedia in Portuguese. Like all the videos on those channels, share them with your friends and check out the material that is really worth it. Please subscribe to both platforms. Thank you, and may God bless you.